It's good to see everybody here today. I am excited to continue our journey through the Old Testament book of Judges. And if this is your first week here, or you just missed the last few weeks for one reason or another, we began this 5-week series through the book of Judges about 3 weeks ago now. And the book of Judges records one of the darkest periods of history in Israel's saga. Over a span of more than 300 years, the same tragic cycle repeats. Israel turns away from the Lord and runs after the gods of the surrounding nations. In response, God allows them to experience the consequences of their rebellion as foreign nations rise up against them and oppress them. And yet, even in that judgment, His mercy is never absent. When the people cry out to God, He raises up a deliverer, a judge to rescue them. And the pattern forms the rhythm of the book of Judges. Rebellion, discipline, desperation, deliverance. But as the story unfolds, something else becomes clear. The cycle isn't just repeating, it's spiraling. Each generation drifts further and further from God, and each judge reflects this deepening decline. These judges are not flawless heroes like we were often taught in Sunday school. They're not shining examples of spiritual strength. They are a deeply flawed and motley crew. A courageous woman leading in a man's world, a fearful farmer hiding in a wine press, a rejected outcast with a tragic story, a strong man enslaved to his own appetites and desires, and of course many more on top of that. This isn't a lineup of polished saints. It's a gallery of cracked vessels. And yet God still uses them. He works through their weakness to rescue His people, to break the grip of oppression, and to restore peace, at least for a time. Now, last Sunday, we looked at Gideon. His story began with fear and hesitation, but over time, God transformed him, enlisting him, encouraging him, and empowering him to accomplish what once seemed impossible. It was a story of growth, of faith taking root, and of a man being shaped by the power of God. But today, we turn to another judge, and this story feels a little bit different. It's heavier, more complicated, more tragic. Today we meet Jephthah, a man shaped by rejection, marked by hardship, and ultimately remembered for a decision that would cast a long shadow over his life. And once again, the familiar pattern unfolds. Israel turns away from the Lord, and they find themselves once again under the crushing weight of oppression, this time at the hands of the Ammonites. And in their distress, they cry out to God for deliverance. And as He has done before, God raises up a deliverer. But this time, the deliverer isn't found in a place of honor or stability. He's found on the outside, far from home, surrounded by outcasts. Jephthah's story unfolds in 3 clear movements. First, we see that Jephthah is rejected. He's rejected by his own people and his own family, even. His story doesn't begin on the battlefield. It begins in his own home. And the Bible introduces him to us with a tension that defines his entire life. We read in Judges 11, verse 1. Now Jephthah of Gilead was a great warrior, but his mother was a prostitute. Before we ever see his strength, we're confronted with his stigma. Before we hear of his victories, we're reminded of his past. Jephthah was born into a fractured home and had a fractured identity. His father, Gilead, was a man of standing in the community, but Jephthah was living proof of a scandal that everybody wanted to pretend didn't happen. And though his father brought him into the household and cared for him as he did the rest of his sons, the rest of the family never truly accepted him. He grew up on the outside looking in. tolerated, perhaps, but never embraced. And when his father died, whatever fragile place that he had in the family just disappeared. And we read in the next verse here, when these half-brothers grew up, they chased Jephthah off the land. You will not get any of our father's inheritance, they said, for you are the son of a prostitute. Rejected, disowned, cast out, Jephthah fled to the land of Tob, a place far from home, far from family, far from everything that should have been his. And there, on the margins of society, he built a life as a bit of a loner. And it's easy to move quickly past moments like these in scriptures. It literally took 2 verses to tell his backstory. But rejection has a way of shaping a person. It leaves wounds that don't easily heal. It raises questions that don't easily go away. Who am I? Where do I belong? Does my life really matter? And if those questions go unanswered, they don't just disappear. They follow us throughout our life. They influence how we see ourselves, how we relate to others, even how we relate to God. And maybe, if we're honest, that's where some of you are today. You know how it feels to be pushed aside, to be overlooked, to be defined by something in your past that maybe you didn't even choose. Maybe it was the failure of a parent. Maybe it was something spoken over you years ago that still echoes in your mind. Maybe it's the quiet sense that you don't quite measure up and you don't quite belong. Jephthah's story reminds us of something we need to hear. Your past may shape you, but it does not have to define you. Because while people may reject you, God doesn't. Long before Jephthah was cast out by his family, he was known by his Creator. And God had a plan for his life. And the same is true for each one of us. You are not an accident. You are not an afterthought. You're not overlooked by heaven. The God who sees the outcast, who hears the cries of the forgotten, and who draws near to the brokenhearted, did not abandon Jephthah, even in the land of Tob. And he's not going to abandon you either. But as we'll see, even though God had a purpose and plan for Jephthah's life, the wounds of his past didn't simply disappear. And those unresolved wounds would follow him into the next chapter of his story, because the one who was rejected is about to be recruited. The next stage of his saga begins with Jephthah being recruited. Now, time has passed, and the man who had been cast out learned how to live on the land. He learned how to survive apart from society and the city in which he was born. In the land of Tob, far from the place that he once called home, Jephthah built a life among other overlooked and unwanted people. Scripture actually puts it this way in verse 3. It says, "Soon he had a band of worthless rebels following him." A band of worthless rebels. How would you like to go down in Scripture as being described as a worthless rebel? They were outcasts, fighters, men who, like Jephthah, had nowhere else to go. And they saw in him someone worth following. But something began to take shape in the wilderness. What started as mere survival began to be forged strength. And what began with rejection slowly grew into an incredible reputation. Over time, Jephthah became known not for where he came from, but for what he could do. The man who had once been dismissed by his family was becoming this capable leader and this formidable warrior. And then one day, the past came calling. When the Ammonites went to war against Israel, the people of Gilead found themselves desperate, outnumbered, and in need of leadership. And in a moment rich with irony, the very elders who had driven Jephthah away went searching for him in the land of Tob. And when they found him, They say this in verse 6, "Come be our commander. Help us fight the Ammonites." It's hard to overstate the weight of this moment. And these were not strangers approaching him. These were the very men who had rejected him, the ones who had told him that he didn't belong and forced him out of his own father's house. Now they stand before him asking for help, appealing to the strength that they once refused to recognize. And Jephthah responds with a question that reveals the depth of his wounds. In verse 7, he says this, "Aren't you the ones who hated me and drove me from my father's house? Why do you come to me now when you're in trouble?" And the answer is as simple as it is revealing. In the next verse, they reply, "Because we need you." Let that sit for a moment. Because we need you. Need has a way of changing people, doesn't it? The same voices that once rejected him are now trying to recruit him. And the same hands that pushed him away are now reaching out to him for help. Why? Because they need him now. And in that moment, Jephthah is faced with a decision that goes far beyond strategy or survival. He could walk away and just let them face the consequences of their own sin. They had made this mess. He could have just let them live in it. He could have held on to the pain of his past and refused to step back into that relationship. But instead, Jephthah agrees to go, accepting not only the role of commander, but the responsibility of leading the very people who once cast him aside. That kind of decision requires a different kind of courage. It's one thing to fight an external enemy on a battlefield, but it's a whole other thing entirely to confront internal wounds, to return to the place of rejection, to stand face to face with the people who hurt you, and to lead them anyway. It takes strength that most people never develop. And for a moment, it looks like everything's coming together, right? Like this is one of those stories that's going to wrap up with this beautiful bow at the end. Jephthah is going to be the hero. Everyone's going to realize how great he was all along. And it's kind of like a Disney movie. But don't get ahead of yourself. The outcast has become the leader. The rejected has been raised up. And the warrior has finally been given a place to belong. But as we'll soon see, a change in position does not always mean a change of heart. Because even though Jephthah had been recruited and elevated, something deeper remained unresolved. And that unresolved tension will surface in a moment that's as tragic as it is sobering. As the one who was rejected and then recruited becomes reckless. That's the last movement of his story, is Jephthah being reckless. As Jephthah prepared for battle, Scripture tells us that in verse 29, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. And this is the same terminology that we saw with Gideon, and we see it later with Samson. All of these supposed heroes of the book of Judges were cloaked in the Spirit of God, and that Spirit empowered him. He marched toward the Ammonites with strength and confidence. Everything was in place for a decisive victory. And yet, in a moment that feels both unnecessary and a little unsettling, Jephthah makes a vow. He says in verse 30 and 31, to the Lord, "If you give me victory over the Ammonites, I will give to the Lord whatever comes out of my house to meet me when I return in triumph. I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering." This has an ominous tone to it. Almost like it's setting up a plot twist later on in the story. And it's a shocking statement, not just because of what he promises, but because of what it reveals. So God had already given him his Spirit. God had already assured him of his presence. There was no need to bargain, no need to negotiate, and yet Jephthah attempts to secure what God had already promised as if victory was something that could be purchased with a vow. This is not the language of faith and trust and obedience. This is the language of transaction. And if we're honest, it's not unfamiliar to us. Right? We may not make vows as extreme as Jephthah's, but we know what it is to say, God, if you will do this, I will fill in the blank. And almost everybody here has said that at some point in their life. God, if you do this if you get me through this, if you help me with this, I will, whatever it is. We try to leverage obedience. We try to trade devotion. We treat God less like a father to be trusted and more like a deal to be struck. And Jephthah goes into battle, and the Lord gives him victory. The Ammonites are defeated. The victory is decisive, but the tension of his vow lingers in the background. And then he comes home. And Scripture says in Judges 11, verse 34, when Jephthah returned home, his daughter came out to meet him, playing on a tambourine and dancing for joy. She is his only child, his joy, his future. And in an instant, victory turns to devastation. His stomach drops. And he tells her, oh my gosh, what have you done? I made a vow to the Lord to sacrifice whatever comes out to meet me, and now you're the one who came running through the door. The words he spoke so rashly fall on him like a crushing weight. The reckless vow that he made in haste now demands an answer. And here's the trouble. The text leaves us in that tension. We're left to wonder what exactly happened after this. Because Scripture tells us that he kept his vow. But we're not told exactly how he kept his vow or what happened next. And there's a lot of commentators that try to push open a window of possibility here. And we'll say, well, he didn't necessarily sacrifice his daughter as a burnt offering. He could have dedicated his daughter to temple service, like a nun. Just taking her to the temple and say, hey, you live here now, you're going to work here now, which is the reasonable alternative to actually sacrificing his daughter. And it's something similar that we see in the story of Samuel. But Samuel's mom actually promised to dedicate him to temple service. And Jephthah didn't. Jephthah promised a burnt offering. And it says that he kept his vow. And so we're kind of left in that tension of, did he really sacrifice his own daughter? Would a godly man do such a horrible thing that God himself has said repeatedly he hates and abhors? But this is the tragedy of misguided faith. He believed in God, but he didn't understand God. He sought God's help, but he approached him on human terms. And in so doing, he treated God like the pagan nations around him. Human sacrifice was incredibly common in all of the cultures around Israel. Israel was the only one that was forbidden to do such a thing. And yet they drifted time and time again into worshiping the pagan gods around them. He assumed that the favor of God could be earned through bartering rather than received by grace. And the result is one of the darkest moments in the book of Judges. It's a sobering reminder that not every promise made in God's name honors God's name. God has never asked us to bargain for his blessing. It's never required us to manipulate him into action. What he desires is not reckless vows, but faithful obedience. God's not impressed by grand promises made in emotional moments. Even Jesus warned us not to make vows, but instead to just let your yes be yes and your no be no. He is honored by steady trust and simple obedience over time. Jephthah's story forces us to ask an uncomfortable but necessary question. Are we trusting God, or are we trying to control Him? Because when we try to take control of the outcome, instead of trusting God, who is truly the one in control, when we speak rashly, when we commit impulsively, when we act without wisdom, our words can create consequences that we never intended and cannot undo. So as we pull back and we allow Jephthah's story to settle on our hearts, we're left with both a warning and an invitation. A warning against trying to bargain with God, and an invitation to trust Him with humble, obedient faith. Jephthah was rejected by the very people who should have loved him. He was cast aside, pushed out, forced to build a life on the margins. And yet in time he was recruited and raised up by God to lead those very people in their moment of desperate need. God used him. God empowered him. God gave him victory. But in the end he became reckless. And as a result, Jephthah's story is a mixture of triumph and tragedy. And his story stands as both a warning to heed and an invitation to embrace. A call to trust the Lord, not with rash words, but with faithful lives. Now, next Sunday, we'll continue our journey through the book of Judges as we explore perhaps the most tragic story of all, Samson. I hope that you'll join us. But as we close today, maybe you can relate a little bit to Jephthah. Maybe you know what it feels like to be rejected by the very people who should have loved you. Maybe you've been pushed aside or overlooked or left carrying wounds that never fully healed. Or maybe, if we're honest, you've made some hasty decisions, spoken words, or made promises that you wish you could take back. And if that's you, I want to encourage you to bring all of that to the Lord. Not with desperate bargains or empty promises, but with humble and honest hearts. Jesus, our true and better judge, doesn't turn away the wounded or brokenhearted. He receives them. He restores them. He redeems even the parts of our story that are marked by pain or regret or failure. And if I can walk with you in that step of faith, I'd be honored to do so. So please don't hesitate to reach out. In the meantime, let's stand and sing together, church.